Morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being with us, and those of you who responded so quickly to us yesterday as we all tweeted and emailed out. I'd like to start by speaking to Marion Budd, who's the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, and who I think is now on the call. Are you there, Bishop?
Yeah, but she's muted.
Are you there and unmuted?
Yes, I am. Good morning. It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. You are in Washington. I want to start by asking you, first of all, just what it felt like to be there yesterday as all these events unfolded before your eyes.
The range of emotions is difficult to articulate in a few words. Shock, outrage, deep confusion, and also alarm at the way the events unfolded with some predictability, without adequate response from all involved, whose role it is to keep the city safe. And what I mean by that is we've had a couple of dress rehearsals with this group before. And keep in mind, we're in the midst, as the world is, in the midst of a global pandemic where public safety depends on keeping people in physically distanced ways and keeping people safe. And so the mayor, for example, rightfully asked that all residents of the city stay away from the protesters as they were coming in large numbers, very clear, an early curfew, stay away, do not engage. However, we have many people whose livelihood depends and do not have the option of staying away, right? They had to go to work, and they had to go to work in these hotels, and they had to go to work in these stores and in these restaurants that were catering to the people who were coming into town. And these are people, mostly people of color, who do not have the option of not working, and there was no safety provision for them. Moreover, we have vulnerable residents who are without housing, and there was no protection for them. And so one of the things that the religious community needed to do was to gauge, forgive me, I realize I'm speaking very quickly. We had to gauge how we could be of help when there were no formal mechanisms for support for vulnerable workers, vulnerable essential workers, and people who were on the streets. While at the same time, and I'll stop soon, while at the same time, we were witnessing such a disparity of treatment between those protesters who had come into the city, not just yesterday, but before, predominantly white, and the contrast in the way those protesters were treated relative to those of the summer in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the racial hypocrisy is devastating to the city, absolutely devastating. The trauma of witnessing that, of witnessing the disparity has been one of the overriding themes of the people I serve. And so I could go on for an hour, but I'll stop there because I know there are others that you want to speak with.
Well, I'd like to ask you another question, if I may. I mean, you saw how religious imagery was appropriated by the insurrectionists and how the name of God and Jesus was used. We had an email from somebody from the Philippines who I think is on this call, who said, you know, they couldn't believe how the mainstream church has been sidelined or how co-opted into this. And I just wonder what all this says about the challenge to, and indeed the failure of American churches, that this has happened.
Well, first of all, I would like to say that the voices who were speaking, calling upon, I mean, I know this is true of every other person from the United States who was on this call, we completely disassociate ourselves and the Christian message from what's being promulgated in this movement. And we have from the beginning. And there was nothing Christian about what we witnessed today and everything leading up to it. And if we have been sidelined, I think in part it's because of the relative, the growth. I mean, the megaphone that the religious leaders on this particular side of the Christian spectrum have. and the way they have been brilliantly co-opted by political forces who were using them to further their own purposes. I don't excuse them. I vehemently speak against them when it speak against that particular aspect of the distortion of Christianity. It's nothing new. It's been true of the Christian church from the beginning that it is easily co-opted by forces of power. But you're right, we have every responsibility to do that. And if I fault anyone, there is a large portion of the Christian community, and I understand this, that want very much to create a safe space in our society for people of all points of view to gather and to reflect and to discuss, and that the church should be a place where we can do that. And I want that too. I want that too. I want the church to be a buffer zone where people of goodwill and of different points of view can come together to discuss what is best for the public square, because none of us has a full insight into the will of God in the public arena. However, there are times, and you know this, there are times when it is equally sinful to be silent. And gauging when those moments are is the responsibility of Christian leadership. And we've been in this for some time. And so it is not just those who are voicing the most heretical, blasphemous forms of Christianity, but for those who choose to remain silent because it is because they don't want to lose that authority of the middle space. And you know how hard that is, right? I know how hard that is.
Thank you very much. For now, thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
I'd like to go to the Reverend Winnie Verghese, who's in New York. Winnie is a priest and chief at Trinity Church, Wall Street, and the Chief Justice and Reconciliation Officer there. And your church, Winnie, is right next to Ground Zero, and some commentators have been saying that, you know, this is another sort of almost a 9/11 moment for America in sort of facing something. And I just wonder whether that resonates at all, or whether you think what you would say in response to that.
Yeah, I've seen the same language, and I guess where I would agree is just how profoundly traumatic the images that we all saw on those screens were for all of us. It's in the you know, if Wall Street is the temple to the economy, you know, Washington is the temple to our democracy, and the Capitol building is. And so that trauma of our closely held ideals of who we are as a people, and on Wall Street with 9/11, that's also just about our sense of security as a nation. So yes, and I would say, as Bishop Buddy has just said, that these truths unveiled, frankly, yesterday, you know, kind of appropriately, maybe on Epiphany in some ways, are things all over the country that I think we would say we know about ourselves, but haven't had to look at in quite that way. Who is vulnerable, who is safe, who is America for, who is the Capitol for. There's language around policing in this country that came into the mainstream media yesterday by talking heads that I've not heard before in quite that way, that understanding of how differently policing works for Black and brown people, and for white people, and for white nationalism, and for a sense of reform. So I think in those ways, something really profound about who we are and who we idealize ourselves to be was absolutely revealed yesterday. It was devastating.
I mean, it was clearly a very, very fearful moments yesterday. Is there still a sense of real fear today, do you think, in America about, you know, whether this is the beginning of something or the end of something, or what exactly it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's early in New York, so I don't know how people are really feeling, but what I can say is I think we are a nation that is so anxious and on edge, and has been for at least 4 years, if not longer, in some communities, our entire existence here. But the last 4 years have been shockingly stress producing. And part of what it's done to us is we're all on our toes all the time. So many more of us are looking for ways to manage anxiety, depression, and aligned with real threats coming from leadership in our country, and from white militias and white nationalists who had been a more marginalized voice before a couple of years ago. And you can also find that in what has become our mainstream media, these threats to many of us. So yes, we are anxious. I know people all over the country that are calling each other, calling their loved ones, making sure their kids got home okay, even though they're nowhere near DC, because we've been living like this for a very, very long time. And in media this morning. You know, most of us stayed up as late as we could to watch, to make sure that yesterday was okay. And you wake up this morning after very little sleep and see again that the white militias are saying we're coming back, and we're coming back more armed. And I think we used to think those things weren't that serious. And then we had Charlottesville, and now we've had these marches all over the country. And I don't think anyone doubts that they're coming back to DC.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Chinny MacDonald now in the UK. She's a writer and broadcaster on race and faith issues and a contributor to Radio 4's Thought for the Day. And she's also the head of public engagement at Christian Aid. And Chinny, I know that you and I were sort of tweeting late into the night and early this morning. It's an American story, but you clearly feel it's not just an American story. What are your first reflections on what's happened?
So, interestingly, thinking about hearing my American colleagues talk about it, I was feeling the exact same sense of stress, physically shaking. I found it hugely traumatic to be watching. And I think for me, the reason for that is, as a Black woman who has watched the brutalization of Black bodies for all my life, and more vividly in the past few years with the death of George Floyd, it was what Marian said, it described as the racial hypocrisy that was made manifest in front of our eyes, which I found absolutely devastating. And for me, as someone who is a Black woman but grew up within the white evangelicalism, I grew up watching God TV, grew up with people like Franklin Graham, Kenneth Copeland, Wayne Grudem, all these people who are now vocally supporting Trump despite everything. Despite the racism, despite the misogyny, despite his narcissism. And that to me is devastating, because I think yesterday I was almost reliving waking up on the morning of the 2016 election and Trump having been elected. And for me, it felt like I had woken up and didn't recognize my own family. All of a sudden I realized that actually these were not my people, despite all the years of having kind of pretended like they were people who cared about, I guess, the essence and the truth of the faith. So I was thinking about that, but also thinking about what that means for UK evangelicalism. I used to be Director of Communications at the Evangelical Alliance, and I did see it as my calling almost to try and detoxify this brand. I wanted to make it more appealing to Black women like me, to younger people. But I think I've realized that evangelicalism, both in the US and the UK, is a place where white supremacy reigns. And we need to confront that. We need to not try and explain it away. We need to wrestle with these truths that have existed for decades, for centuries, and confront that and make a change.
Thank you so much. That brings us nicely on to our next guest. I'll hand over to Ruth now to take us forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie. And just bringing in, if I may, Dr. Robert Jones. Robert, you're the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, and you wrote a book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. I suppose my first question is the clue is in the title. Was what we witnessed yesterday the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity?
Well, in short, yes. I think we saw it on great display, and I'll make just kind of 2 points here. One is to remember the context, that we are at this great moment of demographic change in the U.S. Just between 2008 and the election of Donald Trump, we moved from being a country that was demographically speaking a majority white Christian country to one that was no longer a white Christian majority country, right? So we had passed this kind of sea change in the country, and so we've heard words like "Make America Great Again" so often. I think it no longer even has any meaning because we hear them so often. But if you remember, that slogan came out of this context of the country shifting from being majority white and Christian to no longer majority white and Christian, and from our first African American president. Make America Great Again is dripping with racist overtones, right? Coming out of that context. And so if you and the anti-immigrant rhetoric, the anti-Black Lives Matter rhetoric, that we've heard from the president so consistently over the last 4 years. I think it just reinforces that. And it's worth remembering that all of this language about take our country back, save America, was the sign that Donald Trump stood before yesterday morning, calling for people to march on the Capitol. Whenever you hear the word "our" used by this president, it is a signal to white supremacy. It is really so clear that what he's talking about really is turning back the clock to his followers to a time when white Christians really were the dominant force in America. And ultimately, this is all about ownership, right? It is about a declaration of ownership of the country by white Christians in the face of demographic change and an election that they lost. And so I think it's this great dissonance in their minds, and that is very much the part of this legacy. And I think the symbols, we really have to pay attention to them. I'm really so happy to be talking to people who are taking religion seriously, because I think so often the religious symbols go by without enough attention. But yesterday we had, not only Confederate flags, and in fact, as far as I know, I've talked to a couple of historians of mine. Yesterday was the first time that a Confederate flag flew inside the U.S. Capitol building of the United States of America, right? The Civil War, Jefferson Davis wasn't able to do that, but these protesters supporting President Trump yesterday were the first able to do that. There was also the Christian flag carried, a white flag with a blue canton and a red cross. That is actually, I grew up evangelical in the South. That was the flag that I said a pledge of allegiance to as part of Vacation Bible School in my Baptist church in Mississippi. Growing up, very recognizable, symbol. There were crosses, but there were also gallows set up on the outskirts of the Capitol building. So Confederate flags, gallows, Christian flags, shofars being blown, references to Jericho. I mean, it was all right there in front of us. This unholy amalgamation of white supremacy and Christianity. And, in my book, the last thing I'll end here, but in my book, this was not just, the book has the word the legacy, right? But this legacy is so very much with us today. One of the most astonishing things I found in the book is that today, looking at white Christians today, if you take your average white American and you add Christianity, they become more racist. That's what the data shows. Today, that's how deep this infection inside of Christianity, and voices like Bishop Varghese and Bishop Booty have been such courageous voices pushing back on this, but we haven't done nearly enough in the mainstream white Christian church to make it so that carrying a Confederate flag and a Christian flag in the same march does not seem like such great dissonance happening.
Thank you, Robert. And just moving on to Professor Andrea Hatcher. Professor, you are at the University of the South, and you've written about the political and religious identities of British evangelicals. Can I ask you just something about the theology in all of this? That Robert's just been describing how this is a kind of untrammeled course towards white supremacy within the church. So why have church leaders allowed this to go unchallenged?
That's an excellent question. And I think I would start by saying that yesterday, we saw the culmination of Christian nationalism in this country. It was a full-throated insurrection, an attempt for these groups of white insurrectionists to claim ownership over the people's house, over the people's branch of government. And let's not forget just how symbolic it is that it was the Capitol that was attacked, the first branch of American government that our framers gave us in the Constitution. And they were walking in with impunity as if they had ownership, a right to be there to claim that space for themselves, whereas other groups, as Bishop Buddy has noted in the summer, were brutalized in the whole of DC. And your question, Ruth, why has this been allowed by evangelical leaders? I was thinking a lot about this in recent times from my own lived experience in American evangelicalism, that there is much about that appreciates and elevates and is comfortable with authoritarian leadership. And I think that explains their embrace of Donald Trump. So many pastors in white evangelical churches are there for their lifetime. are there in the hold the ministry for 20 or 30 years in a single church. Sometimes it's in an inherited position, so the son will take over after the father, and they hold the pulpit and manipulate the trust of their parishioners over that lifetime of leadership that they are there. And so congregants, white evangelical congregants, are very trusting of this pastor, and they look, it's almost in political science terms, it's this strongman model of leadership, this big chief model of leadership. And I think that why white evangelicals so embrace Donald Trump, because that is the type of leadership that they are so comfortable with and seeing in their churches week after week. And why do evangelical leaders go along with it? Because it is the very type of leadership that they have known and they espouse themselves.
So I just got one final question for you, which is, I saw one of the tweets that you retweeted, which was a YouGov poll taken after the events in Capitol Hill, where it indicated that Republicans, a majority of them, said that, what extent do you think Donald Trump, Republicans, said they would vote against certifying the election results? And the majority of them said that Donald Trump was not at all to blame. And I'm just wondering if you think the situation has gone so far without check that it is now impossible, very difficult to draw back.
I'm sad to say that I think that is the conclusion that I draw. I was overwhelmed by those numbers from the YouGov poll. 52% of Republicans think that Biden is to blame for what we saw yesterday. 85% think that it would be inappropriate for there to be any further action to try to remove Donald Trump. Those are not marginal numbers. And so I don't know on what basis then, if our political leaders are looking, and some Republicans tried to draw back last night, perhaps some withdrawing their objections that they had otherwise promised to give, some senators doing that. But looking at numbers like this, if they are thinking about their own political lives, their political futures, they have no basis to try to course correct or enact the 25th Amendment, to follow impeachment, or do anything else to punish the president that incited that insurrection and that violence yesterday.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your reflections. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague, Andrew Brown.
I'm going to start with Mike Lewis, who runs a website called Where Peter Is, which is what you might call the traditional opposition to the traditionalists. It's Catholics who actually believe in the Pope to some degree, even when he disagrees with them. And one of the most striking features of this to me is, from the outside, is that of all the global figures, the one furthest from Donald Trump at the moment is probably Pope Francis on almost every issue you can think of. Within the American Catholic Church, what are the proportions, do you think? How many side with Francis and how many side with Trump?
Well, if you look at the, I'd have to say, if you look at the votes, 50-50, we reflect, the Catholic Church reflects the United States. But the problem, however, is that among practicing, devout, involved Catholics, maybe of a more conservative or traditional bent, I would say that it's a majority are opposed to Francis. It started, I think, as a theological thing. Francis was elected in 2013, and there were certain cardinals and bishops who objected to his message, thinking it was too liberal or too modernist. Cardinal Raymond Burke, an American cardinal that resides in Rome, was one of the main figures. But then when Donald Trump came around, there was a conflation of this political resistance, or of this theological resistance with the political resistance, and it picked up some momentum. The idea that Pope Francis is a socialist, Pope Francis is a Marxist. So a lot of this propaganda has caught on. I mean, right now, everything is anecdotal, but I would say I get 3 letters a week minimum from people who say, just discovered your website and this describes my entire family, or this describes my entire church, or all of my Catholic friends are opposed to Pope Francis and following Archbishop Vigano. I mean, it's a growing problem, and I don't think there hasn't really been a study, but there's no, I think it's been underestimated.
Okay, so what is the media landscape that sustains this? Where do these people get their stories? What are they going to think about what happened yesterday?
So I was following this on Twitter yesterday. The main and most powerful outlet is EWTN, the largest global religious television network in the world, based out of Birmingham, Alabama. They've got some very powerful funders. Frank Hanna is a billionaire based in Atlanta, Tim Bush. And basically they've been openly promoting Donald Trump. They have a program on Thursday evenings hosted by a man named Raymond Arroyo, who has interviewed Donald Trump a number of times. Yesterday, he tweeted that that event had a Les Miserables air to him. And he showed a video of a fire extinguisher being exploded inside the Capitol building. So a lot of them are actually romanticizing this. And their news report the day before said something to the effect of, tomorrow is Donald Trump's last chance to overturn the election results. So they've really been fostering this narrative. And this is, EWTN back in the 80s and 90s, it was the station that pious old ladies would watch to, with devotionals and praying the rosary. Okay. And now it's become this political mouthpiece.
Right. And there was one moment, not at yesterday's rally, but at the Trump rally before that, which seemed to me to summarize the whole thing, which was the appearance of Archbishop Vigano, who appears as a kind of theological dissident, giving a message to these political dissidents. And Vigano has gone full on Trumpist. I mean, he is saying that the Democrats are part of a satanic conspiracy, literally. Can you just give us some feeling for the alliance between the theological and the political conservatives? Fairly briefly, I'm afraid, but
yeah. Well, basically what I think that the key here is the abortion issue. Really, the fact that the Catholic Church's position on abortion is that it's immoral, and they've been able to leverage that to demonize the Democratic Party and to make it sound like the Republican Party is the only alternative, and then they pump in, so that hooks them theologically, and then politically they just pump in the propaganda, and that's kind of where that's what I see. Okay. Because that's what's used at the most basic level, and then from there it gets more and more conspiratorial, and okay. Vigano obviously is the extreme.
Conspiratorial is a very good word on which to bring in our next guest, Joe Ushinsky in Miami, who's an expert on QAnon. Are you here, Joe? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I can see you, but one never knows if people can hear. Great. We had you on in the summer talking about QAnon, and you said then that actually there was quite a small number of believers. But yesterday, this poll came out that we were talking about earlier of Republican attitudes to what had happened. And one of the questions was, do you believe there is a satanic pedophile ring controlling things? And 17% of Republican voters said, yeah, they believed in that. What's happened? How did we get here?
So one thing we need to do is to separate QAnon followers and believers from people who believe in satanic cults and Satanist pedophiles running the government, because those are two different things. So a lot of the beliefs that QAnon has adopted are beliefs that long predate QAnon. So QAnon only started in 2017, but the ideas of a pedophile deep state go back decades, if not centuries or millennia. You could go to the Oliver Stone movie JFK and you find a pedophile deep state working against the president. So most of the ideas in QAnon are not new. And when I poll on ideas like the poll you're discussing, I find that sometimes up to 30% of Americans buy into ideas like that. But that's not QAnon per se. And in fact, many of the people who believe that have never heard of QAnon, aren't directed by QAnon, and don't know what it is. So having been polling on QAnon specifically for the last, more than 2 years, I could say that it's small and not getting bigger. It could get bigger, but it hasn't. So just to put it into numbers, what?
Sorry to interrupt you, but the guy who, there was that very memorable video most of us saw yesterday of a policeman retreating up the marble stairs of the Capitol. In front of these protesters, and the lead protester, the guy who was driving him back into the thing, was wearing a Q t-shirt. They seem to be fairly strong within the movement.
Well, that's one guy. So, one thing that the media has done, unfortunately, in the last year and a half, is try to draw broad conclusions about how many Q believers there are based on who's wearing a t-shirt at what Trump rally or who has what sign at what Save the Children rally. But that's not a great way to judge who believes what in the broader population. That's why I do polls. So when we poll on this, what we find is that usually between 5 and 7% of Americans say that they are believers in or followers of QAnon. And that hasn't grown. And to put that in perspective, that puts it on par with the amount of people who believe in the reptilian elite theory, people who believe the moon landing was faked. So it's very fringe. So we just don't want to confuse that small group of people with, people who believe, broader ideas about government.
Well, I still think that 10% of the American population is about 10 million people, which is a minority large enough to scare me.
Sure, but we want to have perspective on all these things. And in a big country, we need to expect that there's always going to be fringes and cults and people believing all sorts of weird things. That's nothing new. But if you were to make the claim that QAnon is big and getting bigger, you'd be factually incorrect. Okay. If you want to say that some of the beliefs that QAnon has adopted are fairly popular out there, whether it's 5G is causing problems or anti-vax beliefs or that the government is controlled by evil Satanists, or beliefs about the prevalence of child sex trafficking being much higher than it actually is, then sure, that would be true. Those beliefs are fairly prevalent out there. But people who follow QAnon closely it's a fringe amount.
All right. Well, thank you. I'll hand back to Rosie now. And,
Thank you. Thank you. Just before we go to our discussion, I'd just like to briefly talk to Reverend Canon Broderick Greer, who's from St. John's Cathedral, Denver, and I would describe as a theologian and activist. I hope he's happy with that description. Broderick, I'd just like to ask you to share an image from yesterday and reflect on what that tells you about what the situation facing both the Black Lives Movement and the future of Christianity in the US. It's a big question, but if you would.
Thank you, Rosie. And it's so good to be with so many friends and people I read this morning. One of the most compelling images for me from yesterday is a very short clip of a video. It was about 45 seconds. And it's a video of the U.S. Capitol facility staff cleaning up the mess from yesterday's insurrection. And as is the case with the way our racial hierarchy works, not only in the U.S., but often in the UK as well, the staff was all Black. And there was a lot of chatter among people I follow on social media about how this is such a metaphor for the way that sort of the democratic experiment, if you will, in the US works or doesn't work. The fact that white insurrectionists, violent insurrectionists, are able to, with great ease, enter the halls of power of the United States. In some ways, unfortunately, at least image-wise, it appears that the Capitol Police basically let them into the US Capitol, which of course evokes images of the War of 1812 and the burning of the US Capitol by England. And to think that, you know, in 2021, the people who are there to take care of the trash and the debris of such a violent intrusion on our democracy are the people who benefit least from those halls of power. You know, which is, it's devastating, it's disturbing, and it goes back to so much of what one of my favorite journalists, Nicole Hannah-Jones, has written about in terms of, in the United States, Black Americans in particular have been really the heralds of democracy and believed in democracy before white Americans believed in democracy. And the display of yesterday and so much of what has been discussed on this call in particular shows that a significant portion of Americans do not actually believe in democracy as we understand it today in a multiracial country.
Thank you so much. I'd love us to come back to you in a moment if we might, but we are being very pressed for time now. We've got quite a lot of questions coming up in the box. I'm going to hand back to Ruth to field those.
I wonder if any of the journalists are brave enough on the call to come forward. Harry Farley, you just put a question in from the BBC. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, it was just a question. I mean, following on from Christopher Lamb's question in the chat box as well. Do you expect this to be a turning point for Trump supporting Catholic bishops, but also evangelical leaders like Robert Jeffress and Franklin Graham and so on? Do you expect this to be a turning point for their support for sort of the Trump movement? Or do you expect them to sort of heed Biden's appeal for unity? Yeah, I guess a particular question for Andrea and Robert in particular.
I saw your question there, Harry, and I was intrigued in that. One of the things that I did yesterday on social media was to follow along to see what sort of statements, public statements that evangelical leaders were putting out. And it seems to me that they fall into three basic categories. So for example, you have Russell Moore, who is head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. You have Albert Mohler, who is president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, making a bid for the leadership of the Southern Baptist Convention. And those two issued a direct denunciation to Donald Trump. And in fact, Mohler says that President Trump is responsible now for unleashing mayhem. So those seem to be the strongest language there. On the other hand, I looked at some other leaders who are on President Trump's spiritual advisory board, such as Paula White, Franklin Graham, and they do not denounce President Trump's role in this, do not mention him at all. There are these vague and generic calls for peace, maybe a denunciation of the violence, but not of President's role in that. And then you get some like Rodney Howard-Browne, prominent charismatic leader from Florida, who is so wrapped up into the conspiracy theories and is just following that full. Speaking a full-throated embrace of that these were not true MAGA people who did this. These were, in fact, Antifa in disguise and whatnot. So you have the denunciations of Trump on one hand, the continued embrace of conspiracy theory on the other, and then from the most prominent of leaders, such as Franklin Graham, what I think are rather vague and weak, simple calls for peace that I don't expect will have any significant change in altering the views of their followers. Perhaps, Robert, you have a different view.
No, I think I largely agree with you. I mean, it's worth remembering that white evangelicals and their leaders have had 4 years to see who Donald Trump is. Right, nothing that he did yesterday is anything that he didn't say he was going to do. So we're here. In fact, the American public saw this coming. We, in a poll in October, PRI asked whether people thought there would be violence from white supremacist groups following the election, and 70% of the U.S. public said that they were worried that there would be violence from white supremacist groups following the election, and 57% of the public said that they thought Trump's speeches and actions encouraged white supremacist groups, right? So the American public, I think, wasn't that surprised. And if you look at the exit polls, white evangelicals still voted for Donald Trump, 8 and 10, in this election. That's exactly the number that voted for him in 2016. And that's after his equivalences of, fine people on both sides in white supremacist, marches in Charlottesville and all of that. So nothing that President Trump has done in the last 4 years has deterred white evangelical support at all. In fact, I would argue it's part of, it's not a bug, it's a feature, right? It is part of their attraction to Trump is his speeches and behavior around issues of race, pluralism in the country. So I don't expect any of that. And one caveat I just want to offer around American Catholics is there's a huge ethnic divide among American Catholics. And if you look at American Catholics as a whole, it is right that they look about like the country and are divided. But if you look inside there by ethnicity, white Catholics voted nearly 6 and 10 for Trump, and Hispanic Catholics voted 2/3 for Biden, right? So if you kind of take into account that white Catholics, white mainline Protestants voted nearly 6 and 10 for Trump as well. White evangelicals voted 8 and 10. For Trump. So it is a white Christian allegiance across evangelical, mainline, and Catholic groups, and it's the whiteness inside of that Christianity that is. There's no greater distance, for example, between Black Protestants and white evangelical Protestants. Black Protestants voted 9 and 10 for Biden. White evangelical Protestants vote 8 and 10 for Trump. So I don't see any movement here. And Andrew, check me on this, but I don't think even for people like Mohler, who said it was a moral imperative to vote for President Trump, I haven't seen any of them taking responsibility themselves for being wrong and confessing in any way.
Can I just leap in there, because I know that the bishop has to go, but I do have one more question for her before you have to go, and thank you for joining us. I would like to ask you what initiatives or movements there are amongst church leaders, established church leaders in America after what's happened. Are you talking to Republicans? Are you talking to Democrats? Are you talking to each other? What will happen next?
Well, as my colleague Winnie said, it's 9:30 in the morning, and so we have some calibrating to do. We have some regrouping to do. Although, as many of you have suggested, this is not something that is unfamiliar terrain to us, and so we need to take stock and consider conversations. I am watching and listening for people in the evangelical world that have remained largely silent, or who have emphasized issues of character and morale, people who I really respect. I want to say these are people I truly, truly respect, but have deliberately kept their voice out of any particular public engagement. And I'm watching and would love to engage them. And there's one woman in particular that you all should be following very closely, and that is Beth Moore. If you don't know her already, she's just an enigmatic evangelical woman leader who is taking very, very bold stands against her tribe, if you will, in this. And her following is tremendous. And so these are the people that I feel have potential to sway, to move the conversation. Those of you who are students of social movements know that there's a lot of fluctuation that happens in times like this. And then what happens next is really key. And so I would ask for your prayers. I would ask for your compassion and allow. I also want to say that I feel that President-elect Biden is attempting very hard to follow President Lincoln's playbook. If you read the chapter from Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, and you read the chapter of how Lincoln navigated after he decided to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, it almost, I just feel like President-elect Trump is trying to lead from that place. Whether or not he will be successful, I think depends on a lot of how the rest of the country's leadership decides to move. But I'm deeply touched by his strategy at this moment for as long as he can to try and call the country together. Again, whether he will be successful, I cannot say. And I don't know yet. I would be foolish to say to you that I know exactly how best to lead in this moment. And so I would ask that the Spirit of God be our guide, because this is, and again, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, that every action is rife with danger in ways that none of us have anticipated before. And so we're walking by faith, not so much by sight, and allowing our core convictions to guide us when the Spirit is not especially clear. So I want to thank you. I do need to sign off. And I do appreciate the goodwill and the wisdom that is represented in this gathering. And I'm honored to be among you.
Thank you very much for joining us, Bishop. I'm sure it'll be a busy day ahead for you.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could pick up some other questions in the chat box in the remaining minutes of this call. This is an intriguing question, and I don't know if Winnie, perhaps this is one for you. Why do people describe the Capitol as sacred? What is sacred about it? What is the power and allegiance that sacredness inspires? And how do religious groups propose to protect and promote its sacredness? I wonder if you could tackle that one, Winnie.
I can try. And I think as some have already said on this call, the language of the people's house and the first order is what we mean by the sacredness of the Capitol. It's where the people are represented in our government. And part of the dissonance of yesterday, as I think all of us were glued to our television sets and our social media feeds, is it's actually right for Americans to walk into that house. That actually is what it's supposed to be. But to watch people armed take over the house, I think it took a minute to understand exactly what was happening, because there's a profound dissonance. Of course, people should walk in to that space, but many of us have seen nuns arrested in Statuary Hall for suggesting that we should all have access to food in this country, right? We've seen all kinds of protesters that we value as religious leaders arrested in that space daily during the Trump administration, every administration, literally supporting life, right? Supporting the end of the death penalty and all kinds of reform that we need as a country. So I use the language of it being a temple to our democracy, and it's exactly right. These are the shrines to these ideas of what America could be. Again, as others have said, we have hit the tipping point. We're a majority minority country in many parts of our country, and we are diverse. And we've seen in this election that if we simply register voters, this vision of a more progressive, democratic, inclusive America wins. We are the majority. The only way to suppress this majority is to not permit the majority of Americans to vote. And that's the agenda on the right. So so what we're seeing is a resistance to something that is that's inevitable unless we create an American apartheid. And some would argue that we have it, that disenfranchises a majority. And so in America, we will use the language of democracy as our highest ideal. And I would agree with Broderick, we're not even close. But minority groups in this country have held that ideal faithfully and earnestly, that we actually aspire to that ideal. And I think what we see is that those in power historically do not aspire to that ideal. It's a cover for a white nationalism. And I just want to point out that in religion reporting, one of the pieces that I find really intriguing is Nancy Pelosi opened the session in the evening, faithful Catholic, right, with a reference to Epiphany, which is also how she was quoted yesterday in media, and then the prayer of St. Francis, which she called the anthem of her city, San Francisco. This is a leader who led on AIDS, who was led on inclusion for her entire adult life as a political leader, and is a faithful Roman Catholic and representative of many, many Roman Catholics. And Biden is as well. And what does it say about how we think about what is legitimate religion? That religion, those are two white Roman Catholics, faithful Roman Catholics formed in the Roman Catholic Church. They're not positioned as religious leaders, though she opened a session in our democracy, right, in an elected body, with a reference to profoundly religious ideas, Christian ideas. That isn't interesting for some reason to mainstream media, but the Christian cross, which again, powerful, right, a cross in front of the Capitol and Christian flags inside the building, very powerful, important for us to understand what it means. But I am interested in why that story is told, and that Christianity that I would say is lightly held and nationalist and deeply problematic from my perspective. We know how to name that, but we don't know how to name that for Pelosi and Biden.
Thank you, Winnie. I wonder if I could just try an experiment with all of our guests on the call. If we could ask you for a sound bite to end this Zoom briefing. What can be done to transform America? Who wants to take that first? Bearing in mind the soundbite, 40 seconds. Broderick, can I go to you first?
I'm a preacher, so I am not good at sound bites. I'm good at talking for a long time and being long-winded. But I think the key to building a multiracial, inclusive democracy is listening to all of the people who have benefited the least from sort of a monoracial, white nationalist republic that has been built over the last, over 200 years. So listening to the concerns of working people, listening to the concerns of people who don't have bank accounts, listening to the concerns of people who did not finish high school, who do not have access to a lot of the economic opportunities that white Americans take for granted. So, listening to basically, in many ways, our lowest common denominator, and knowing that in that listening is the key to the liberation for all of us.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Robert, 40 seconds.
Yeah, so just two quick points. One is, since I've got a bunch of religion reporters here, to think about our terms. We've heard nationalism, I think, and if that word is used, I think it has to have two adjectives. It's not just Christian nationalism. It's not just white nationalism. It is white Christian nationalism in order to be accurate to describe what we're seeing. But to your point about where do we go from here, I think, as many rightly declared yesterday, the violent disregard for the rule of law we witnessed is not the best of who we are as Americans. But I think we shouldn't move too quickly to only say that. We have to also confess that what we saw yesterday, that too is a troubling part of America's political and religious heritage. And we have to do that if we're going to heal our nation from this deadly disease.
Thank you. And Andrea?
I would just say that, as has been discussed here, is Christianity, as we know it, was not represented in the insurrection and the violence that we saw yesterday. Neither was conservatism or constitutionalism. What happened yesterday was a direct result of 4 years of the Republicans failing to exercise their constitutional duty to check and balance this president. And leading into another question or another point I see there in the chat box, where will Republicans or white evangelicals go after Trump? I don't know that they're going anywhere. It was telling that one of the images yesterday was an American flag being removed from the Capitol and replaced with a flag of Donald Trump with his visage on it. So I think that, again, getting back to an earlier point I made, this is a cult of personality. The allegiance is to the man of Donald Trump, not to Christianity and its precepts, and not to the American Constitution and democracy.
Thank you, Andrea. Joe Uzinski.
So I think the problem that we witnessed yesterday was twofold. One is unscrupulous politicians who are willing to build coalitions, and people in the public who have anti-establishment views mixed in with a bunch of dark personality traits like psychopathy and narcissism and inclinations towards violence. And we saw the culmination of that yesterday. When Trump's gone, that will solve a lot of the problem, because you won't have a president of the United States, telling people to go out and commit violence on his behalf. But these views will still be out there in a large population of the American public, ready to be harnessed by any politician who wants to harness them. And we've seen that, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Josh Hawley or other people in Congress right now who want to take advantage of these views for their own ends.
Thank you. And Chinny, you have the last word. 40 seconds to our friends on the other side of the pond.
So something that I've heard time and time again over the past few years, but also in particular last night, was this sense that this is not America or this is not Christianity. I think part of the way that we move forward is recognizing that this is America and this is evangelical Christianity in particular. And the problem that we need to confront ourselves with is that this is ultimately the main problem is this sense of whiteness as being supreme, and whiteness as being entitled to power, and whiteness being worthy of protection against violence, and the corollary of that being the brutalization of Black bodies. So I think that to move forward, we need to confront America's original sin of racism and white supremacy, and it's only by doing that that we can move forward. I think what we saw yesterday was on our screens what that looks like, and so many people were horrified by that. But we have this opportunity now, as we saw with George Floyd's death, is that we can see it in front of our eyes and therefore confront it and therefore move forward.
Thank you, Chinny. And thank you to all our guests for joining us today, and to all of you who are new who've joined us on the call. Do keep in touch with us. Look at our website, which will have a report on this, and our YouTube channel, where the film will go up later on today. So meanwhile, all our good wishes from the UK to all of you in the USA, and I'm sure we will do this again soon. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Bye.